Dan Norton is going to come up and read our first passage.
All right, this is in your red Bibles. If you do want to follow along, page 827. It's Hosea, chapter 11, first 4 verses. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them.
Thank you, Dan. As I was collecting these flowers from the florist yesterday, I was reminded of a businessman who wanted to encourage a colleague who had just opened a new branch office. So he sent a little floral arrangement over, and the next day he got a call from his colleague who thanked him for the thoughtfulness, lovely flowers. He said, but I was just a little puzzled by the card. It said, "Rest in peace." So the businessman says, "Oh, I apologize about that." He called the florist right away and said, "Hey, what happened? That's an embarrassing mistake." And the florist said, "You don't have it so bad. Just think. Somewhere in the cemetery is an arrangement that says, 'Good luck in your new location.'" Well, typically on Easter Sunday, the lectionary has us reading the gospel lesson, the report of Jesus' resurrection. But today we're going to stay with the parables. We're staying with a particular parable, one that I think you'll recognize. And I want you to think about this. If the gospel message is a great sailing ship, you can think of the good news of Jesus' life and death and resurrection as being the ballast in that ship that keeps it upright. And you can think of this parable as being some wind in the sail to help us move along. So keep that in mind as you listen. This is a classic parable. It involves just several characters in dramatic action and raises a profound question. It ends with a question that's not stated, but it is clearly planted in the minds of his original hearers and audience. There's 2 different acts, a beginning and an end to it, and unfortunately, our tradition has kind of had a love affair of this parable that has emphasized only the first act, often to the neglect of the second act. So much so that in many Bibles or traditions, this parable is named the prodigal son. Well, actually, it starts off this way. A man had 2 sons. So listen and see if you can tell the shift from the first act to the second. It's in Luke 15, beginning at verse 11. Luke 15. And Jesus continued. He said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So make me like one of your hired servants." So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost and now is found." So they all began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called to one of the servants, and he asked him, "Hey, what's going on?" The servant said, "Well, your brother's come back home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, all because he came back safe and sound." Well, the older brother became angry. He refused to go in. And so his father went out to him and pleaded with him. But the older brother answered his father, "Look, all of these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. And that you never gave me even a young goat to celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, the one who squandered your property with prostitutes, when he comes home, you kill the fatted calf." "Oh, my son," the father says, "you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad because your brother, he was dead, but now he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found." I'm tempted to just leave it there. What a powerful tale. The first act, of course, focuses on this younger brother and his rebellion, his wandering, his reprobate years, his bottoming out, and then his coming back home. And the second act focuses on this older brother, the one who stayed home, who tended to the responsibilities of the farm, the one that refused to enter in the celebration of his brother's return. So let's just take a look at what's going on here. First, we'll talk about the audience. Who was Jesus talking to when he said this? And second, we'll take a look at the sons, and then finally, we'll consider the father. So the audience. Who was Jesus talking to? Well, if we look up at verse 1 of chapter 15, we read this. "Now tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners. He even eats with them.'" So you get two categories of people. There's the tax collectors and the sinners, and then the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Who are the tax collectors? Well, we know them. They were collaborators with Rome. They were turncoats, collaborators, traitors. They benefited from Roman rule by becoming an extension of the Roman machinery to extract taxes and remove resources from Israel. They benefited from that. They sided with Rome for personal profit against the well-being of their own family, their own nation. Tax collectors, not well liked. And sinners. Who are sinners? Well, it's a broad category, and it includes anyone for one reason or another who gave up observing the expectations of Jewish law. Prostitutes, sure, but also those who paid for prostitutes, those who lent money out at interest, those who took advantage of their neighbors, those who neglected the purity laws and disregarded the Sabbath. People who were either uninterested in or felt unable to pursue the life of character and virtue as understood in the Jewish tradition. So tax collectors and sinners, they come out intentionally to hear what Jesus has to say. Then there's another group, the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Well, they're ones who thought that the best way to advance national interests was by observing God's law and so earning God's favor. The way to get rid of Rome is by being so good that God will reward us by kicking them out. It was an issue of national identity and God's favor. And they did this with great conviction and integrity, I believe. Typically, they had the financial means that allowed them to devote a lot of time to observing the law, because to observe it fully took a lot of time. And actually, they also felt pretty good about their efforts to win God's favor. Well, these two groups made up Jesus' audience, two kinds, the non-religious and the hyper-religious. One was attracted to what Jesus said, the other offended by it. Now keep that in mind as we look at the two sons, two kinds of son, and actually two different kinds of rebellion. First, the younger son. He goes to his father while his father's still alive and says, "Give me my inheritance." Now, when do we typically pass on inheritances? Yeah, when mom and dad are dead and gone. This guy can't wait. I'm young. I want to use my energy and youth. Dad, give me my inheritance. And the father obliges. Says he divided his property. Now, the older brother, by rights, would have received 1/2 of the property. The younger brother would have got 1/3. There's another 1/6 left. I'm not sure what happened to that. But the father gives him 1/3 of his property. Pretty amazing. And then it says he moves to a far-off land, distant country, someplace maybe where he wouldn't be known. He could live as he wanted, living la viva loca, right? The tradition often calls him prodigal. Prodigal means this. It just means recklessness, extravagance. It means spending everything, exhausting all of your resources. The older brother accuses him of wasting his money on prostitutes. However he spent it all. And then he hits rock bottom. It's doubly difficult for a Jewish boy to end up where he ends up. He's feeding pigs, which would have made him unclean. He's so hungry, he longs to fill his stomach with the pig slop. But something happens to him there. There's this phrase. It says he comes to his senses. Now, we might think that it was appropriate to say that the problem with this younger son is that he gave too much emphasis to his senses. He was living a sensual life, pleasing the appetites of his body, his eyes, his stomach. But something happens here when he's hungry and alone, that he wakes up, he becomes aware of who he is and what he's done. This week I was reading in T.S. Eliot's collection, The Four Quartets. The last of those 4 poems, Little Gilding, includes this episode where the author, after a sleepless night, walking on the streets of a city ruined by flood and fire, bumps into an old acquaintance. And the old acquaintance shares with him what it's like to grow old. First, you lose your sense of taste. Fruit becomes like a phantom. There's no joy in it anymore. And secondly, there's the loss of power. He writes, the impotence of rage at human folly. Have any of you felt the impotence of rage at human folly? But then finally he writes this, at last, there's the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been, the shame of motives late revealed, the awareness of things ill done and done to others' harm, which you once took for the exercise of virtue. Here's a guy coming to his senses. He reenacts. You can imagine him lying awake at night, replaying things that he did that once upon a time in his youth, he thought this is the virtuous way to be. This is right, but now he sees, no, it came out of some hidden selfish motivations, and it was effective, causing harm to others and done ill. Oh, the grief and the sorrow of that. Well, so it must have been something like that with this younger brother. He comes to his senses. He's reenacting perhaps those decisions, those conversations with his father and his brother back home that led to his leaving in the first place. And he decides, I think courageously, that it'd be better to be a servant in his father's household. So he drafts a little speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be your son, called your son, so make me like one of your hired servants. And then the passage says, and so he turned and went home. It probably took a while to get home. He was in a distant country, and he was broke. Didn't have money for airfare. And he probably repeated that little speech many times, over and over. If I was him, I would probably use that little speech to push away those memories, those reenactments of all those ill deeds done. Well, what about the older son? The older one, what do you know about him, the guy that stays home? Well, we know this. He worked hard. The passage says, I've been slaving for you. We know that he's obedient. He says, I never disobeyed your orders. We know that he feels overlooked or perhaps taken for granted. You never gave me a young goat to have a celebration with my friends. We can surmise that he was envious of the attention that the father gave to his younger brother. We know that he's kind of stubborn, and he's not going to go into that house. He's not going to have a piece of cake or a grilled goat sandwich. Fatted calf, I guess it would be beef, right? So he stays outside, stroking his own ego with the assurance of his own righteousness and nursing bitter feelings about his wasteful little brother. He feels so good about his own position that he decides to challenge his dad. He questions his dad. Ask his dad to pay account for this extravagant reception. It's easy to imagine sibling rivalry, isn't it? Who's dad's favorite? Does dad have a blind spot or a soft spot for one that doesn't deserve it? The pastor and theologian who's now deceased, Tim Keller, he calls the older brother a moral conformist. That is, he meets expectations. He accomplishes his assigned tasks. He does his best not to upset the boat. Other people come to rely on his steadiness. And he understands that their shared life is wrapped up with a bunch of material goods and a system of operation. So you got to keep the farm going, to keep the goods growing, to keep the cash flowing. And so he's there taking care of business. Home, for the older brother, is more about material goods and keeping those goods flowing than it is about relationship. Feelings, aesthetic expression, relation, those things all take a back seat to the hard facts of the economy. Moral conformist, says Keller. I think if we asked the older brother, he would say, no, just dutifully responsible. That's what I am. Well, whatever we call him or categorize him, there's a big contrast between him and his little brother. His little brother, Keller says, is on the road of self-discovery. Well, maybe he's a little more artistic. Maybe he's more interested in self-expression. He's the kind of guy that would go on adventure in search of himself. Sure, we need material goods, he might think, but in themselves, they carry no meaning. If they don't help you enjoy the deeper aspects of relationship and the higher expressions of human spirit, then what good are they? Well, both these brothers look askance at the other ones. And they probably think that the problems with the household and the town and perhaps the whole world is exactly the way of life that their brother embodies. If you were only more responsible, says the older brother. Well, if only you were more compassionate, says the younger brother. Power and force and discipline, these things will secure our future. No, creativity and cooperation will do that. Common good trumps individual expression. No way. Individual freedom and autonomy, that's all that really matters. You can imagine the argument. Do you know these kind of people? Do you recognize those attitudes and moods even within yourself? Well, in the end, as the parable reveals, both ultimately are ways of rebelling against the Father. Both of them lack gratitude. Both of them want to live life on their own terms. Neither are particularly interested in a relationship with their dad. Both want accountability to no one but themselves. Two ways of being separated from the Father. Breaking all the rules and even keeping them all diligently. Keller again says it's a shocking message. Careful obedience to God's law might serve as a strategy for rebelling against him. I would add, protecting ourselves from true relationship with God. It might perhaps be a way of trying to manipulate God rather than relating to God. What about us? I think we all have a little bit of both of those in us individually. Collectively, what about us as a congregation? It's hard to say. Going to church on a Sunday morning in New England, that says we lean conservative, right? A New England congregational church, that suggests we lean liberal. Both are true. And we all rebel in different ways at different times. Well, finally, let's consider the third character, the third big player, and that is the Father. He responds to different sons who have their own way of rebelling, but he has one and the same response to both. Let's look at the younger son first. This passage says, when the younger son was still a far way off, his father saw him and ran to him. That tells us two things. One, even though he was counted as dead, he never gave up hope. He kept looking. He was watching on that horizon, down that dusty road, a long ways off, and he recognizes him. His eyes are still sharp to know a son that he loves. And he runs. He runs to them. Now, this is not a thing that a dignified Middle Eastern gentleman would do. Run down the road. Especially not to greet a son who had already wished that his dad were dead. Well, but out of his great love, he sees him and he runs to meet him. And what does he do? Well, the son starts reciting that little speech that he had practiced. Father, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But before he can finish it, the father interrupts him. And he turns to the servants. He says, go, grab a robe, the best robe, and put it on him. And bring a ring for his fingers and sandal for his feet. And while you're at it, let's kill that calf. We're going to have a party. My son has come home. With a robe and the ring, the father is saying, you are here. You are fully welcome and received as an honored member of the household. With the robe, he's saying, you have the keys to the house again. And with a ring, he's saying this, if you can believe it. And you have the authority to speak in my name, even. Oh, man. And the fatted calf, well, the father can't help it. He's overcome with joy. So that family resource you save for special occasions, this is the occasion. We're going to have a party. The son that was dead is alive again. What an extravagant response to this one How about the father's response to the older brother? This responsible guy, dutiful guy. He learns about the party going on and he stands outside. When he learns that the party is given in the honor of his snotty-nosed little rebellious brother, he's not going to have any of it. Even such that he speaks disrespectfully to his dad. Look, Dad, look here. Don't you know who I am? Don't you see what I've done? I've kept this place going for you, and you don't even care. Never had a party once for me. And the father responds, says, my son. You know that word, my son, actually it's a broader word in the sense, my child. The biblical commentator Stephen Mitchell, his whole commentary on that little piece, it just says this, child, such tenderness. You can imagine that older son being so angry. He's spitting in his dad's face because he's got to express so much. And the father responds with such tenderness. Child, you are always with me. I see that you've never left. You're here. And be assured, all that I have, it's yours. He was just stating the legal fact at that point. You get it all. Right? And what I have, and what I want here, is for you to share in my joy. Because this member of our household, your little brother, your own flesh and blood, he's come home. I thought, to me, good as dead, but he's come back. Won't you please come in, share my joy, join in the celebration. In both of these cases, we see the father acting the same way. He initiates. He runs down the road to meet his younger son. He goes outside of the party. Again, not a dignified thing for the patriarch to do when he's the host. He goes out to this. It'd be easy to say, if he's got a nasty attitude, who wants him? But he doesn't. He goes out. He pursues him. And secondly, this pursuit requires humility on the father's part. He's not beyond resting on his own pride. Both of these sons, I should lick them into order, both of them. They deserve a good beating in their act like this. He doesn't say that. Rather, he humbles himself to express his love. The only condition is just that they look to him. They want restoration. Wow. It's pretty amazing. We call this often the parable of the prodigal son. I've titled the sermon, The Prodigality of God. And why is that? Well, because prodigality, like I said before, is recklessness, extravagance. It's spending everything down to the very end. And it is the father here who appears reckless. He flings out his forgiveness without calculation. He liberally spreads his love around without counting the cost. He spends his own dignity until he has none left, all out of love for his children. The Apostle Paul in Romans 8 unpacks what that means for us as children of God. He writes, what then shall we say in response to God? God's choosing us and calling us and justifying us and glorifying us. Well, if God is for us, then who could be against us? He who did not even spare his own son, he gave him up for us all. Won't he with Christ, along with him, generously give us all things? For Christ who died, well, more than that, Christ who was raised back to life, he's at the right hand of God, and so he intercedes for us. So who can separate us from this love of Christ? Should hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or the sword? No. In all those things we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither life nor death or angels or demons, nothing in the present or the future, no powers, no height or depth, anything in all of creation can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. You know, when we hear Christ say on the cross, hung there, it's life flowing out of him quite literally, and says, "It is finished." We see the action of a prodigal God. Spends it all, gives it all for the sake of those whom he loves, and does so in such a way that doesn't shy from humiliation. No, God's seeking of us is such that nothing can separate us from his love. That is nothing in all of creation except our refusal to enter the party. Where are you in this story? Well, you can be in the house, or you can be outside the house. You can be in the house celebrating. You can be dancing in the kingdom. You can be basking in the warmth of the Father's love and relishing the joy of belonging. And if you're not inside the house, then you're outside. And if you're outside, there's a couple places you can stand. You can be in the pigsty with the younger brother. You may not know it yet. You may not have come to your senses yet. You might still think that the path you're on is the best way to the good life. It's how you're going to find freedom and fulfillment and purpose and strength and meaning and belonging. But by God's grace, someday you'll come to your senses and you'll see that no, this is not the way to life. You'll wake up. Then perhaps with humility and gratitude, you'll turn your face again to seek the Father. Or another place you could be is outside the house, where the servants stand on their smoke break, hanging out with the older brother. Not irresponsible, but not in a relationship either. Rather, stroking your ego with self-righteousness and stewing in your own injured and inflamed pride. And perhaps even today, the Father to you is pleading to come in. Don't just be good. Be joyful. Don't just be responsible. Be in relationship with me. All that I have is yours. And all I want is for you to join me in my joy. I said that this parable ends with a question. It hangs in the air. It's not spoken out loud. And the question is this: will that older brother respond? Or will he hold to his pride and stay outside? And the question sets with us too. Will you enter into the Father's embrace? Well, one way that we have of responding and regularly turning again to the Father, regularly again entering that house, is through the celebration of communion, by which we remember Christ's death and look for his return again. So we're going to celebrate communion this morning, and I invite anyone, whatever your journey and whatever your position, if you're in, the only qualification is this, an intent to say, yeah, I'll enter that party. I want to be a part of that celebration and God's joy. Then I invite you to participate in communion with us this morning. A couple words of introduction. We use non-alcoholic juice and gluten-free bread. So hopefully that will not provide an obstacle for anybody. And I'd ask that as you receive the elements in your pew, then you hold them and we all partake of them together. But before we receive the elements, I'd invite you to open your bulletins again and join me in the prayer of confession, and pray it in as much as your heart will allow you to say it with conviction.